19 and the care economy and addressing unpaid care work and domestic work. I will be your moderator today, and I would like to begin off by introducing our panelists. On my far right, I have Alana Kembabazi. Alana is the program manager at ISA. ISA is Initiative for Social, Economic and Economic Rights. Alana, your handwriting. That works to advance socio-economic rights, and Alana is the program manager specifically for economic inclusion and fiscal policy. Right next to Alana, I have Esther. Esther is the head of programs at Groups Kenya. She has over 10 years experience and has been involved in research and advocacy, as well as implementing interventions to reduce the burden of unpaid care work. And right next to me, I have Esupat, who has been in leadership for over 25 years as a councillor at Longido District Council. She's a chair lady of the grassroots movement and chairperson at a CBO called Look Up. Did I say that right? Okay. And also a chairperson at Muendo.org. So very, distinguished panel. Thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you to FemFord, Groups Kenya, Urgent Action Fund, and all our partners for supporting us today. Right, so I want us to start off with situating this conversation, right? Because I'm sure there's people who are watching and thinking, unpaid care work, what's that? Why is this something that we need to care about? So I'm going to start off with you, Alana. What's unpaid care work, and why is it something that everybody who is watching needs to be thinking continuously about?
Thank you, Twasima. Unpaid care work, broadly thinking about it, is work that is done within a household. And some have argued it could even be beyond a household. It could be also in a workplace. That is not paid for, because people tend to, it's just done, someone carries the load. But actually, if you quantified it, if you thought carefully about it, you'd be paying for it. And you may wonder why we are complaining. If some of you have been following what happened in Kenya, where the court said, a wife should be able to get something for unpaid care work, where they essentially were saying, she does this, she takes care of the kids, she does that. And you may wonder, why are we shouting about this right now? There's been increasing consensus that this is a human rights issue. Because if you think about it, normally in the capitalist economies in which we are in, work has some sort of economic value to it, a productive wage. And in human rights, we talk about the right to decent work. But then you have this whole category of things that people do. Maybe you're a stay-at-home mom, and you're taking care of the kids. Or maybe you're a working person like me, but still, you find you're the one who is planning the meals. You rush your father to the doctor. There are all these things that your other counterparts are not doing, but you have to do for the smooth functioning of the home, and sometimes even the smooth functioning of whatever workplace you're in that are outside your job description, that are not paid, and there's a real cost to them. In terms of why I think it's also an economic rights issue, they found that that unpaid care work, these things we don't even think about, the fetching firewood if you're in the village, the water, the cooking for the kids, or just even planning their meals, it could point out, you know, the little things that are done each day. Who takes the child to the hospital if they're sick? Who stays up with the child at night? Who takes the, you know, your people to hospital? And also what happens in a society like ours where we face inadequate public services, right? So when there is no health, when there is no education, it is women that are making up the gap. I have been to communities in Amdat where they become now the healthcare workers. Like the child gets sick, it's the women going looking for aloe vera, getting it, turning it up and down and so forth. So when the state also fails to deliver on its social contract in terms of making sure there are good quality public services like health and education, the unpaid care work happens, it increases. And the result of all of this is there is a group of people that are left out of the workforce who never get compensation for their time. We hurt our economies, we hurt our families, and we ultimately hurt the development of the country by not paying sufficient attention to this issue.
Right. So, you know, unpaid care work is the work that no one notices until it's, you know, not done, right? I'd like to bring you in, Esther, at this point, because I'm sure there's people who are thinking, well, this is just how things have always been, right? This is just the ways in which gender roles are assigned. And I want you to contextualize this for us from the Kenyan aspect. What is unpaid care work? How do you see it continue to play out in different societies, and in what ways is it then leaving women behind?
Yeah, thank you so much. First, allow me to thank Agent Action Fund for facilitating this conversation, and also a lot of appreciation to Femi Forte for really organizing this event in Kampala. As you said, my name is Jael, and I work as a head of programs at Groots Kenya. In my perspective, or in my country's perspective, and we've had this conversation for a long time, that unpaid care work is the activities that we undertake for our own end use, or the family, or relatives. You see, they include things like housekeeping, they include things like taking care of the elderly. My colleague has already talked about taking care of the children, cleaning the houses, and all that. You see, things that are behind the scenes. And I'll contextualize it by maybe talking about the issue of the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is where a family member or someone chooses to forego unpaid work and undertake to forego paid work and undertake unpaid work. And most of the time this happens against women, because we live in a patriarchal society where a lot of household work is actually supposed to be done by the women, and men only concentrate maybe on paid work. So when this happens, when there is maybe a crisis in the family, like the way we've now had the COVID-19, the way we've had the HIV and AIDS in the past, most of the people who forgo paid work to take up unpaid work are mostly women. And because of this, we face a crisis as globally, but also at the national level, where now the contribution of women does not now feature in our national accounts. And of course, we all talk about the GDP. You see, the contribution of women, or the kind of work that the women do, does not feature in our GDP. Meaning that if the countries, for example, were to distribute money because of our contribution, or distribute services because of our contribution, women are likely to get lesser services. That's why my colleague has talked about lesser financing of public services. We talk about the public spaces, we talk about the ECD programs, we talk about the services that are mostly used by women. They are really underfinanced, because it's clear that there's no data, or there's no opportunity to be able to measure women's contribution, which is mostly at the household level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting points there around really just like the erasure of the work, right, and the time that goes into this. I want to bring you in, my neighbor, Esupat, you work a lot with grassroots women, and I'm sure there's people who are thinking this is an elite people's problem, right? Maybe the women in rural areas are not thinking or actively worrying about this, right? But I would like for you to dissuade us from, those illusions and just tell us and contextualize for us, even in the work that you do daily, why is unpaid care work an issue, and why is it something that cuts across all social and class identities, particularly for women?
Thank you. My name's Aisupa Tungulupa. I come from organization called Mwedo. I'm a chairperson at the organization. And thank you, organizers and my colleagues, because we are all from East Africa, and I think everything is like the same. But unpaid care workers refer to all the services offered within the household, including domestic work, food preparation, doing dishes, make sure water is available, energy, and overall cleanings. So my colleagues has already talked about all this, and also I come with this perception, and caring for the children, elderly, and the sick. So women, in the personal context, the unpaid care work extends to the caring of livestock. They watering and feed them. So women spend disproportionate time on unpaid care work than men. And during the COVID, spend time on care work for women increased 3 times than men. So I think women are thinking like it is someone can work without any payments. They are not considered in the family level. They are not considered at the national level. So unpaid care work and the COVID-19 and domestic work are primarily done by women even before the pandemic. Women wake up, the majority of single parents household, female-headed households, and before the pandemic, women did 3 times as much unpaid care and domestic work than men. Since the pandemic, a number of the factors added to women's unpaid care and domestic work. That include schools were closed, leading to home schooling, online, learning, helping the children. Women are assisting their children learning mainly in town. By the end of March 2020, UNESCO estimates that over 89% of women, 89% of world's students but population were out of schools or universities because of COVID. So the family members falling sick increased the caregiving task for women. Many of women being teachers, they were giving care at home, at the same time teaching from home. So this increased how women carrying a lot than men. And nobody consider the heavy burden carried by women. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's just really just to contextualize what all the panelists are saying is, first of all, it's important to remember that ILO estimates that on average, women around the world perform 4 hours and 25 minutes of this unpaid care work as compared to 1 hour and 23 minutes of men, right? I would like for us to begin to think about how this affects women in employment, how this contributes to gender pay gap, how this contributes to all the different structural issues that still ultimately allow for gendered oppression to exist, right? Now, Alana, unpaid care work has been defined by some as the missing link that influences gender gaps in different labor structures, right? Now here we are, our economies are where they are following the pandemic and in the process of rebuilding, right? Why, and I don't know if perhaps this can be defined as an opportune time to begin to redefine what our priority areas are, right? So if we did have the opportunity to think through COVID and COVID's implications and then begin to work towards redefining what our priority areas are, I want us to speak to why situating unpaid care work and perhaps going the Kenyan way, where we begin to quantify this and pay women who are doing this domestic labor, is ultimately important as we think about economic growth in Uganda, but also more regionally.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think we're at a cusp where we have two choices before us. Do we go back to the system that was, in my opinion, was a broken system on many regards and left out the vulnerable, especially women? Or do we build back better? And this should have been a wake-up call, because women have always been the ones teaching the kids just think about education. They're often the ones, you teach the child through song. From when they're young, as you do your housework, you teach them through counting, you know? And now, suddenly everyone is like, oh my God, it is so, you have the men going, it's so hard to teach children. It is, oh God, when are schools opening so we can just dump our kids back in school? Because now, especially when it was lockdown and they were also at home with the kids, they recognized, wait a minute, And you can easily quantify. You have a teacher, basically you could have a teacher, a nurse, maybe, a domestic work, a paid domestic worker for the housework, just 3. Maybe you also need to have, if you have an older person, a specific kind of caretaker, like you can go ahead and count the number of roles that are covered by one person. And I think that what we have realized right now, there's a lot more people that have slid back into poverty, predominantly women. The statistics are coming in slowly, but we know that there was talk about 80,000 more people, for example. But we know it's still too early. In fact, the economist Fred Muhumuza says we can't talk about recovery now. Talk about recovery like in 10 years, like we're going to be in this slow coming back for a long period of time. So what does that mean? It means you can't afford losses in GDP because you have simply decided to stick to patriarchal norms and not quantify this. It means you can't afford people not actually being in the workforce if you're really trying to stimulate inclusive growth. It baffles my mind that in this day and age, there are questions about whether or not, for example, women should have breastfeeding stations or childcare. There was a discussion about having childcare in markets. And other countries have done this. In Uruguay, for example, under its Care Act, all children, persons with disabilities, elder persons have a right to care, state-provided care with training. So then that takes it ameliorates the burden of the woman. It frees up time that she can then use to be able to get some money, which also stimulates the economy. And I think we need to begin to also think through whether or not the ways we have structured our economy and what we consider to be productive labor are not actually work. Like, are they things that only work for a certain group of people? Why do you, when you sit here and you talk about Uganda's growth and you do the figures, never consider this part of work as essential to growth? Yet we know that it literally, like, your growth would not happen without this unpaid care work that is happening around it. And that is why I really like the statistic that shows that it actually, if quantified, it contributes more than things like manufacturing, which we think are the big drivers of growth. So I think for us, it's a time to wake up. And sometimes in these discussions, they can feel like, initially, I would be like, okay, so now what do you want government to do? Maybe we do the change at household level. My partner helps. But I gave an example of Uruguay, which is a policy action that can be done. Other policy actions could be you address some of the things that just take away, again, the woman's time. Why don't you have quality public health care? Quality public education. And for education, right, like when we talk about nursery schools in this country, do we have public? We don't. Right? So that means that someone either has to have money and take that child, or has to take the child with her to the market, or then she can't do certain things. Then, so just even being able to have quality public education, quality public health care, accessible to all, would go a long way in also again, ameliorating this burden of unpaid care work. And also social protection, because we live in an era where we know that we've recognized that households have to be able to be more vulnerable to shocks. And some again, if you think about social protection holistically, I know in this country we like to think about social protection as SAGE, but it's supposed to be actually holistic. So if you think about it holistic, then you'd be thinking about, okay, what would really help this person, particularly a vulnerable group, to make sure that they are able to get this extra support. And I think the problem in this country, we often think of social protection as handouts instead of systems, like I say, that tie to things like healthcare and education and minimum wage. And then, of course, at the household level, it goes without saying, sharing domestic work between partners. And yeah, I would say those are some of the things that would go along with that. But also in the short term, as you begin to work on these bigger issues, just having flexible work policies. Because right now there's a trade-off, and I've supervised women before. I've known that when school starts, no one is coming in. The day, like I just know, I even tell them, it's okay. If your child is sick, you know, whenever, like at some point you'll get the work done. I have to be able to trust you. And I think so many of us have, so many companies and places stick to that. We must squeeze every bit of productive labor out of you in these hours, right? But if your child is sick, or if you know that when you get, you know, at a certain time, maybe you have to take your parent to the doctor in the morning and then you can work at night. Like how do we, and that's what COVID should have shown us. For those of us who are lucky to have been working, having a stable income, most of us who are working on Zoom. I, for one, most of my meetings are on Zoom right now. And you recognize that, no, I can actually get things done at my time and be there in the ways I need to be for my family, because there are things that you still have to show up and do. So I think having flexible work policies, even as just, that's something that allies can do, both in civil society, the private sector, and even with government, would go a long way in helping this.
Right. Esther, it seems that Alana is calling for like a redefining of housework and domestic work from, you know, individual women's private responsibility and something that is defined as female labor, right? Mm-hmm. When I think about the judgment from Kenya, it seems that you actually are leading us towards this path, right? But, you know, I can only make that assessment sitting here in Kampala. But I'm curious to hear from you, is that judgment a step into that direction for Kenya as a country? And what are some of the things that we can perhaps pick up as other East African regions in the ways in which you're trying to address unpaid care work and the implications on women?
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Alana. It's clear that you've been following the progress we're making as a country, and that's quite a thing. So yeah, in terms of the judicial ruling that Alana is talking about, it is true that recently we had a ruling on where the judges actually ruled that housewife work is a fully payable work. And for us, it's quite a good progress, because it will set a precedence in determining the contribution to matrimonial property. We are coming from a history where whenever spouses are separating, they are, each one of them is asked, what has been your contribution? And mostly women have been at a loss because they are not able to really account for their contribution. So this kind of ruling, we look at it as quite progressive, and we hope that it really sets a precedence in how an unpaid care work is going to be counted in the subsequent cases. But then just also to mention, we've also made a few policy progress, and one of them, I'm happy to say that we are at the initial stages of developing a policy on unpaid care work. And of course, there are a lot of questions around this policy, especially by people who do not buy in it. But of course, this is our determination as a country, and also the women rights organization, that we be able to have this policy come to place. The other thing that we are very happy about is that Kenya National Bureau of Statistics is currently leading a time use survey, and we see the time use survey is going to be undertaken over like a period of the next 3 years. And it's going to have women record how they spend their time. It's going to have men record how they spend their time. And with this kind of data, I believe that it's going to be used to be able to value the domestic care work. So this is actually an ongoing, and we really hope that there'll be a lot of goodwill and commitment from those supporting it, and especially from the fact that it's being led by a national institution, Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. We're really hoping that it's going to provide data to be able to value the unpaid care work. The other thing that we are very happy about, we also have the breastfeeding bill that's ongoing, and of course, the bill, we are happy because the bill will mandate employers to provide mandatory lactation rooms. I think where we've had good progress is in the private sector in Kenya, places like Safaricom. You walk into those offices and you see quite, they've made huge steps in terms of taking care of breastfeeding mothers, taking care of lactating mothers, or women with children. Even during this COVID situation, Safaricom is also one of the areas where all the women with children or all expectant mothers were actually allowed to work from home, and I think they've not resumed yet. But we see if this bill comes to place, it will now mandate all employers to be able to create spaces within their institution to take care of the unpaid, to reduce the unpaid work for the women, mostly. We also have the mandatory and mandatory paid leave in Kenya, and this is also a way of recognizing unpaid care work. We have both men and men in Kenya. Of course, we may debate about the number of months, the number of days for men and for women, but clearly it's a step towards really good policies to ensure that we are able to reduce unpaid work. Lastly, for this question, allow me to also talk about we currently launched the CBC system, that is the competency-based curriculum in Kenya. And I don't know if we've all had experiences with it, but for us as women rights organization, we see what our children are asking for when they come home. Both boys and girls are being socialized to take up domestic roles. They come and ask for basins to go and wash clothes. They come and ask for food to go and cook in school. We look at it as a system that is actually going to socialize girls and boys to be able to see domestic work not only as work for women or girls, but work for all family members. Yeah.
Right. I hope the people who are watching are paying attention and thinking through with us why this is particularly important. The panelists have talked about being able to finally quantify women's contribution, right? Such that when it comes down to matrimonial property, that we're able to quantify and know that there was a significant value addition. We've talked about its value add to employment and women being able to, navigate the different workforces as equal partners. We've talked about contribution towards ending poverty and to remedying, the climate crisis, and all these ultimately tie back to understanding that unpaid care work continues to contribute towards all these different problems and inequalities we have. Now, ESUPAT, it's very clear from where I'm sitting that this is important, right? And yet we've been talking about this for what seems like so long. So I would just like to tease out why it is that we're not making progress in the ways that we are. What are some of the challenges that are still hindering us getting to that place where paid, like all work is paid for and quantified and not seen primarily as women's responsibilities?
Thank you, all of my colleagues. Unpaid work implication on women. Women are burdened with unpaid care work, domestic work, and therefore have to drop out of the labor force. And children, particularly girls, help their mothers in care work, which affect their education and health in a negative way. So opportunities and ability of women to participate in leadership, politics, and development program are significantly limited by care work. Because by having all these responsibilities in the house, how can you as a woman participate in the politic spaces or any education, all this? So I think women are limited by care work to participate in all these spaces. And paid care work and domestic work denied women economic opportunity and resources, increasing their vulnerability to poverty, GBV, and COVID-19. We are now, we don't have a policy which leads us to expect to be paid for the care work for now. But I think we are in the safe hands because we have our president, Samia Suluhu, and she is a woman. So we are thinking that we are going to change these policies to offer all care workers at grassroots level. Yeah.
So I want us to talk about COVID a little bit, because we hear a lot about, and we're very aware of the implications COVID has had on our health systems, on our education systems, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But perhaps not as much data on the specific effects COVID has had on women, right? I would like us to very specifically talk about violence, sexual reproductive health rights, and employment, right? When we think about many of the businesses and informal businesses that have been affected by COVID, these are owned by women, right? When we think about how many people have been pushed back into poverty, many of those are women, right? It's just because of the ways in which our societies are structured. And I would like for us, beginning with you, Alana, to begin to perhaps talk through what are the very unique effects COVID has had on women, specifically in those three sectors, and what are some of the things that the policymakers need to be aware about, why it's crucial to address those, even as we think, we talk about education, we talk about health, but why is it important to begin to think through tying those other links to our bigger policy goals?
Yeah, we've talked a bit about how COVID exacerbated the unpaid care work of women, and not just in Uganda, like everywhere in the world. It became such a huge issue because even the global north, with all their technology and you could argue higher incomes, was still finding, whether I'm a professor, it is disproportionately falling on women. So I think, one, that's an advocacy opportunity because now it is evident. And hopefully also the men who are allies and staying home also began to realize that. But then when we think about COVID, I mean, the socioeconomic impact of this has been felt by women in a way that is not felt by men. When we talk about poverty increasing, we've talked about a lot of single and female-headed households who then are the ones that have to figure this all out. But even when they are not, even when you're two partners, when there is no food, it is you, the woman. And I'll never forget this story that was shown by the media in the first lockdown of this woman who began boiling stones in water just to keep the kids thinking food was coming. And she had no food. She was she was doing it as a stopgap measure, and is beginning to think through, how do I sort of deliver on these, right? So if for example you don't have income, you're the one now having to do a lot more to try and figure out, how do I get food on the table? How do I? Well, I've seen this in the north where they will say we would go and look for leaves and then this and this and this just to keep the kids' bellies full. But also in terms of who got laid off, right? We know there were lockdowns. We know, for example, bars are closed up to now, and most bar attendants are women. It's a lot. Women disproportionately work in the informal sector, and it's the one that was most affected by COVID, by a lot of the closures, right? And so for women of a lower income, poorer women in particular, but even just, let's say, a lower income quintile, they may not be poor by Uganda's definition of $1 something a day, but those were often the ones that then also either had to keep their job as essential workers and still balance unpaid care work with no support, or have less income, and therefore now any support they may have had, maybe they were able to, with whatever job they have, be able to employ someone else at home or whatever, and now having that disproportionately get increased. And so thinking about that, I think it should get us to think about, when we're legislating, when you're budgeting, who are you budgeting for? When you think about the stimulus packages, how many women have benefited? Remember, the stimulus packages we've had in Uganda have often been, now they've talked about a small medium enterprise that they announced yesterday, but a lot of them were going to, for example, those channeled through the Uganda Development Bank were going with a certain amount of collateral. So there are less women heading those companies, less women really benefiting from that. Some of us have argued for a stimulus package at the household level. And if they had done the cash transfers right, instead of stealing or playing around with the money like they did, but if they had done that right, that is money that would come and then go directly to the woman to ameliorate the effects, whether in poverty, that are happening because of COVID-19, but also then be put back into the economy. But those cash transfers, first of all, the money we now know was, a lot of it was stolen and played around with, and it was never women in the scandal in terms of who, it was like relatives of this person. But also we know that it covered a very limited amount of people. And so I think that the tragedy of COVID-19 is that it made life harder for women on two fronts. One, in terms of their earning capacity. Even those who are trying to juggle somehow had whatever earning capacity stripped off them. No social protection was actually really provided, particularly for women. And at the same time, they're then facing this increased burden of unpaid care work.
Supat, if you would like to jump in there as we think specifically around the implications of COVID-19, how far back it has pushed us, and the very unique ways in which it has affected women. And I think it's important to stress this, because there may be people who assume that, COVID happened to all of us in the same way, but we know sitting here that it did not, right? So just to be able to flesh out why it's important for all policymakers as we think about restructuring our societies after COVID and, different social protections and things like that, why is it particularly important to pay attention to the ways in which COVID has affected women?
Thank you. Women are very much affected, and at COVID-19 and women economy, women tend to earn less, hold less secure jobs, and less access to social protection. So women have fewer savings, which were in turn depleted during COVID-19. And World Extreme Poor, 689.4 million, over half of whom are women and girls, living on less than $1.90 a day. So with the with implementing economic activity, women are particularly vulnerable to layoff and loss of livelihood. So women run business informal, were hit as a result of lockdown and social distancing and reducing market visit. So women who are working around with selling their all thing and doing their businesses, they are not able to move the places where they are moved before, because of the lockdowns and all this, like social distancing. Thank you.
Esther, same question, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think just to allow me, before I get to my main point, just to emphasize on what Alana talked about in terms of social protection. I think it's very true that with the emergency of COVID-19 for example, in Kenya in March 2020, of course, it found women already having huge disparities in terms of equality in labor, economic justice, and violence, and all that. So, what COVID-19 came is actually increased, escalated the issues that women were already facing, and quite actually tripled. In Kenya, for instance, we stopped recruiting or putting vulnerable people like the elderly and the orphans on social protection program in 2017. So in 2017, 2018, women were already struggling with the orphans and vulnerable children. Women were already struggling with the elderly. The government was not recruiting anymore, I think because of the reduced financing. So when COVID-19 comes in 2019, already found women overstretched. And this actually increased the burden on women, that nobody was actually offering them a shoulder. There was no hope in terms of financial support for the already existing unpaid care work that you're already undertaking. So, and in terms of what also Isupat has mentioned, it's the issue of their participation in the economy. COVID affected export markets. Many people who rely on jobs that on production that is exported were pushed out of the economy. There was no longer exporting of our goods maybe to the markets. There was loss of livelihoods among women because, like in Kenya, markets were shut down, so you could only concentrate in your local community. So for me, what COVID did is actually escalated the already existing gender disparities in terms of access to labor for women. To my main point is actually I want to talk about the issue of SGBV in Kenya. And on 30th of June 2019, and before that actually, Kenya had done a study and realized that SGBV, or sexual and gender-based violence in Kenya, had actually tripled. This called on the president, or in June this year, to be able to declare it like an emergency in Kenya, because the number of killings, the number of women facing violence actually increased. And what now this has done, especially to the people we've always called the community health workers, it has increased their work. Most of them have become the main people who are rescuing the people affected with gender-based violence. They have become people who are now housing women and girls that are affected. They have become women who are now engaged in policy dialogues to be able to ensure that governments and other stakeholders are able to address the gender-based violence issues. Unfortunately, we do not have mechanisms on how do we support these women who've become like staff in ensuring that they address, they rescue, they shoulder, and they support women affected by gender-based violence. So they are the main responders on GBV, yet there are no mechanisms at the moment to ensure that they are properly supported. Rescuing mission or rescuing services are a lot. You need shelter houses, you need transportation, you need communication, you need security. You know, for you to work in a woman whose right has been violated, a woman who's been abused, you need security, you need communication, you need safe transport. No one is actually at the moment providing that. Of course, we're already having mechanisms in terms of creating committees, but these committees we are yet to allocate finances to be able to ensure that the primary responders to gender-based violence are actually properly supported.
We have just about 13 minutes, and I would like us to move on to, what can we do collectively and individually. But I would just like to perhaps further contextualize the different roles that different institutions have, right? There's a conversation that's been happening for a while now around why Uganda's media continues to have only men, manos, or primetime TV. And some of the excuses is, well, the women are just not available. But nobody's thinking why. Why are they not available? They're not available because they have to be at home to make sure that kids are in bed, to make sure that all the other invisible labor that we just assume happens is met. Right? So there are different roles and responsibilities. I would like to see the media begin to pay attention and begin to think, what are some of the ways in which we can allow for women to participate a little bit more flexibly, understanding the different roles, that we still insist that women must carry alone, right? I would like for our governments to begin to think creatively. I would like for us at individual domestic levels to begin thinking about the actual implications that this has, right? And I'm just going to ask my panelists to speak a little bit to the different roles, the different institutions, because we understand that, to undo systemic issues needs both collective and individual responsibilities and roles, right? So what are some of the things that we can do at individual level? What are some of the things that civil society needs to be paying attention to? What are some of the things that different institutions, culture, socially need to be paying attention to? And what are some of the things that we can begin to do as a collective to undo these different legacies of inequality? I'm going to begin with you, Esupat, and then go to you next, Esther.
You're talking about the way forward? Okay. Thank you, Twasima. So the way forward is to change the perception that unpaid care work is the sole responsibility of a woman, and it is not a job. And the next one is unpaid care work. The activity needs to be considered as work because one could pay a third person to perform them. Recognition and valuing of unpaid care work through strengthening provision of social services and infrastructures that less the burden to women who are mainly responsible for unpaid care work. The fourth one is to raise awareness on gender norms, stereotypes and discrimination, social institutions, perpetuation, unequal distribution of care work. Responding to the pandemic should go hand in hand with ratifying long-standing inequalities, building a resilient communities with women at the center of coverage, including longer-term recovery packages. Leverage on countries rebuilding economics opportunity to push for the recognition, reduction, and redistribution of unpaid care work once and for all. Thank you.
Yeah, Esupat has talked about really just changing the ways in which our minds think, right? Reframing this conversation around unpaid care work and gender roles to not just situate women in the position that they are, and then to begin thinking holistically as we restructure and deal with the effects of the pandemic. Esther, over to you. What are some of the things that we can begin to do to really tackle unpaid care work as a crisis?
Yeah. Thank you so much once again. There are a lot of things that we can do from the household level to the society and to at the government level. We had a conversation in Kenya recently, and we had a panel of men and women, and we asked them, how do you distribute roles at the household level? In fact, one of the questions that we asked to a man who had 4 children, he had 2 girls and 2 boys, and asked him, how do you distribute roles in your family? And it was very clear that even at the moment, to the most progressive men and women, we still distribute roles that, we tell the girls that, you stay in the house and wash dishes, and the boy, you go outside and take care of the animals. The way we buy toys even today, as at the household level, we still go to the supermarket and allow the boy child to take a car. And when the girl picks a car, you say, no, pick this doll, it's nice for you. So it's a lot of mindset transformation from the household level. We, at the society level, among the religious organization, among the cultural leaders, we still have the patriarchal mindset in our minds that women cannot do this, women cannot do that, women are only meant for household work, they cannot take up public leadership positions and all that. So I think we also need to change a lot of that mindset among at the household level, cultural leaders, religious leaders, political leaders to the highest level. We also need to begin to fast track the policies that we are talking about. There's a lot of policies that I've mentioned, like in Kenya, globally. We know that if we are not able to achieve equality in terms of the labor economy, it will be difficult for us to be able to achieve the SDG 2030 that calls on all of us to be able to enhance equality among the equality for everyone, for both men and women. So we need to begin fast-tracking the policies that we've mentioned about. I'm happy that we have policies that sometimes we may look at them as, we don't take a lot of consideration, or when they are passed, we don't celebrate them. Uganda in September, I think, passed the policy or the strategy on last mile rural electrification, to ensure that everybody is able to access electricity at the household level. Of course, this is something that Kenya did in 2015, and we had a target of ensuring that by 2020, we need to have sure that we have every household connected to electricity. Those are small gains that we need to fast track, we need to monitor, and to be able to even celebrate when they are achieved, because she talked about the issue of access to fuel by women, and this is one of the ways that will ensure that we reduce the time women spend on cooking, the time women spend at the household level because of bad fuel, and they can be able to use electricity and all that. I think the policies also on the precedent that has been said by the courts in terms of matrimonial property. There's a lot of harmonization of policies or laws that we also need to fast track and be able to harmonize. The other thing is about to building, really ensuring that there's properly awareness in the society, so that, because I know that when we talked about when the ruling on having housewife housework being looked at as a fully payable job, there's a lot of debate in Kenya. Of course, people are asking, so who needs to pay her? There's a lot of debate, debate on that. That means that there's really a lot of awareness among men and women across the society to be able to appreciate and even be able to understand why was that ruling made. Of course, we talk about the media, the way the media comes out and really puts out the thing. It may not be the real picture. So that means that we also need to talk to the media to be able, this is a very serious issue that, the way the media put it outside there, like the courts are now demanding husbands to pay their wives. That was not the essence, but the essence is, can we recognize the unpaid care work as a society and a nation?
Right, I agree. So, yes, so we have to wrap up, unfortunately. But I would like for us to end understanding that neglecting unpaid care work leads to incorrect inferences about particularly women's well-being, value of time, which in turn leads to all these different limitations, right? How women are able to access employment, how women are able to navigate different stations in private and public life, if women are able to show up for panels, right? All these things ultimately affect, and I would like for us as individuals and as a collective to begin to think, who is ironing your shirt and making sure that you're ready to go to work, right? Who is making sure that your child, when they come back to school, their homework is done, right? All those very small things that are not quantified, that are not valued, ultimately are being done by somebody. And that's when we talk about unpaid care work and the need to quantify it, that's what ultimately we're talking about. Like Esther said, we're not saying, well, technically we are, but you know, it's bigger than husbands should pay their wives. It's about why it is important, right? It's about being able to quantify that. Right, so we have basically a minute to wrap up. I would like to thank you, my panelists. If you have just like a 30-second, what's the one thing that you want people to remember about why this is important in 30 seconds to the both of you, and then we wrap up. Esther, do you want to start?
Okay. First is to thank everyone who've been watching. Also thank my colleagues in Kenya and the Kenyan women and men who've been watching this show. And just to encourage all of us that let's continue with this debate, because women do a lot of invisible things that if forgotten, it's very easy for the country to fall. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, my colleagues who are watching this panel. And I want to tell women that please change your mind from now. You want to know that you are working. You are not a housewife. Thank you.
Right, and for me, it's to thank you all for watching, and thank you to everybody who has helped put this together. My name is Twasima Bijira, and I have been the moderator for today. Thank you.